you so much. Thanks. Appreciate it. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm really excited to be here. I'm always excited to be in a room full of folks who are interested in the future of education. I am going to tell you some stories this morning because I have been told that I am not good at trying to impart wisdom. So I'm going to tell you some stories and pose some questions about how we think about creativity and learning, and how we might, as educators and as people thinking about education, reimagine what's possible for our students. So I want to start with this image. This is me on the left at age 15, and this was the moment that I fell in love with learning. I was 15 years old, and I grew up in Northern California. I grew up in a family of all daughters. I was the oldest one. And in high school, I had the opportunity to travel with a group of teenagers from all over the country to go to a small village in Belize in Central America and build a community structure. And so this is where I learned how to build. I spent about 2 weeks mixing concrete by hand and learning how to frame a roof, learning how to use a machete to cut down an entire field of weeds. And this is the structure that we built. It was half built in this photo, but we built this gathering space for the community. And we did this with the community. And I remember, even in that moment, and definitely in hindsight, remembering this moment, that this was where learning started to make sense for me, because I did well in school, I took tests and got good grades, but it didn't really stick. And it didn't stick until I had an experience like this, where I was able to do something with my hands, where I was able to contribute something to the world, and to be able to put all of that knowledge, like geometry and science and the ability to talk to other human beings, into something that had purpose. And so this, for me as a young girl, was really the first time I remember feeling like I had value and that my learning was important. So after this incredible trip, I went on to think about, like, how can I do this for the rest of my life? Like, is that a career? Can I just feel like this all the time? And so I discovered architecture as a way to do that. That all of the things that I love doing, reading and math and exploring and traveling and talking to people and making things, was all possible through the study of architecture. So I went on to study architecture and loved learning about architecture. I went to the University of California, Berkeley, and then I did my graduate work at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And I loved it. I loved every moment of it. However, when I graduated and I started working in architecture, I quickly realized that the world of architecture, to me, did not feel like this. It felt very much like a desk job that I did not enjoy. And I also discovered very quickly that I do not work well with authority. I do not like having a boss. I do not like doing creative work that someone else puts their name on. And I wanted to feel more like this. So at the age of 26, this is 11 years ago, I started a nonprofit called Project H Design. And I started this nonprofit with basically no experience running a business. I did not know how to run a nonprofit, but I did know that I wanted to practice design and architecture that felt more like that 15-year-old girl shoveling concrete by hand. And so when I started this nonprofit, I knew two things. One, that I wanted to do work that was connected to communities. And two, that I wanted to help young people have the same kind of feeling about learning that I did as a 15-year-old in Belize. And so this nonprofit, it's now been almost 11 years, and our work has done those two things in various ways, and I'm going to share a couple of those ways. I've also, over the evolution of the past 11 years of Project H, my own thinking about both design and architecture and also education has changed and evolved. And so I continue to ask myself questions that will help me rethink how I can be a better educator for young people. So the first question that I'm always asking myself is, how do we connect all of the learning that's happening, whether that's academic or leadership or technical skills? How do we connect all of that learning that is happening for young people with things that are real in the world and in their communities? So the first time, I'm going to tell a story that illustrates how I think this is possible. So in 2009, I got an email from a superintendent, a leader of a school district in North Carolina. At the time, I was living in California, and North Carolina, total opposite side of the country, very rural, very, very small town, is very different than the part of California that I grew up in and knew very well. And this superintendent asked me if I would come down to North Carolina and help him rethink how to fix his failing school district. The school district was failing in a lot of ways. They had very low graduation rates. They had very high truancy rates. They couldn't get enough human being teachers who were qualified to teach in the schools, and so many of the students were taking all of their classes online, including physical education online. So he invited me to come down as a creative thinker and help him think about how to do things differently. So what I proposed to him, I got down there, and my partner and I, my former partner, we got down there and we thought, we could do all kinds of stuff here. We could rebuild the library, we can make cooler classrooms, we can make cooler playgrounds, we can build and design all kinds of things. But really, if we're going to talk about creativity and design, that has to live in the classroom. You can't just build cooler spaces and then expect students to be creative. That's part of it, but really students need to experience what creativity can do for their own learning and in their communities. So what we proposed to the superintendent was that we would move to North Carolina and teach a high school class. And the class that we proposed to teach was something like a vocational shop class, building things, learning how to do carpentry and welding and all of these hard technical skills, but to put all of that towards a community project, specifically a piece of public architecture for this very small town. And we wanted that piece of architecture to be 100% designed and constructed by high school students. So as I'm pitching this to him, I'm thinking he's going to say no, he's going to say this is a crazy idea, he's going to tell me to go back to California. And in fact, he heard my proposal and he paused and he said, okay, yeah, you start in August. So that's how I became a high school teacher. Turns out, though, that on the first day of school teaching, I didn't know how to be a high school teacher. I knew how to be an architect. And so my students who were enrolled in my class walked in and looked at me, and I looked at them, and we all kind of went, I guess we're in this together. And we spent the next 8 months prototyping, building, researching, exploring what it means to have architecture be a thing in your community that you get to play a part in. I don't know about all of you, but I grew up in a place where I had no say in my physical environment. The buildings that were there were the buildings that were there. The spaces that were green and publicly accessible, I didn't have any say in the making of my own space. And so for my students, just saying to them, we're going to make architecture for our hometown, was like a fundamental shift in what they thought was even possible as a 16-year-old. Like, what 16-year-old gets to build architecture in their hometown? So I really wanted to prove that this was possible. So starting with basic model making, I started asking students, like, what do you even want to build? What should we be building? And it turns out that one of the things that this small town did not have was a farmer's market, a market for anyone selling fresh fruit and vegetables to come and sell and to make money. This is also a place where there are very high obesity rates, there's very poor public health, and yet there's a farming legacy. So the knowledge is there. There's just no community forum to expand upon that. So my students started designing this farmer's market, and looking at other farmers markets. We went on all kinds of trips to visit local ones. And this is one of my students, Karan, on the left, who's presenting his idea to one of the town council members. And I took this photo, and I didn't really think anything of it. And then later, I went back and looked at this photo, and I thought, you know, this is a very special photo, because these are two people in a very divided, a racially divided town that would not have met ever in their lifetimes, and they certainly would not have had something in common that they were excited about. And so this also meant to me that this wasn't just about the building, and it wasn't just about the learning. It was also about something bigger in a community that could be grown through really meaningful education. So over these 8 months, what we ended up with was this very simple structure. And this is basically a front porch. It's just a simple wood structure. But it was designed entirely by teenagers. And as a builder and an architect, I knew the things that had to be done in order to make this building real. I had to have a permit, I had to have funding, it had to be engineered, all these things. And this moment, when we had this final model, I remember thinking, this, for me, is where my architectural education ended. I didn't ever get to build anything. I would make the model, and then critics would come in and tell me they hated it or they loved it, and then that was it. But for my students, this was only the halfway point, because we had made a promise to the town that we were going to build this farmer's market. So after school, the school year ended in June, and over the summer, it was so hot and so humid, and we were on the construction site building this farmer's market every single day. My students understood that this was not just a homework assignment, this was something that had to be completed. And so we spent every single day on the construction site building. This is the structural trusses of the building, raising them into the air. As we're doing this, there are members of the community walking by, and like with this look on their face, like, what is happening over there? Because there's a construction crew of teenagers who are female, male, African American, white. I was in charge with my hard hat on. It was a weird scene. And yet it was really important for the community to witness their youth playing a part and leading this kind of change in this town. So my students, they got up every morning, they were there at 7 a.m., we worked all day, we did all of the things that you would do on any other construction site. We put up the siding, and this is the final building. So at the end of the summer, this was about 2.5 months of construction. At the end of the summer, we had an opening ceremony, and everyone came out from the city. Farmers were there selling their fruits and vegetables. And my students were there standing in this building that 4 months before was a model sitting on their desk. And I remember my student Karan in the striped shirt, the mayor of the town got up and said something, and then he took the microphone from the mayor and he said, I want to say something. And he said, when Miss Emily said that we were going to build a building, I thought she was crazy, and I wanted to drop the class. And now I'm standing in this building that I played a part in making, and someday I want to come back here with my kids and tell them that I built this. And I remember hearing him saying that and thinking, that is exactly why making matters. That is exactly why creativity matters, and why we should be doing these things within the context of learning and school. Not just as something you do when you graduate. You don't graduate and then go and become an architect. Those things should be happening when you're a young person, because all of my students made this building possible. I mean, I helped, but this was 98% they're doing. And so I fully believe that if you can take all of the learning and the skills that students are accumulating and put them towards a real project that has real consequences and impact, that it fundamentally changes the way they think about learning and also the way that we think about the power of young people. So these are some of the things that I learned. from this project. The first is that I think we underestimate how powerful young people are. And so if we give them a say in what they're learning, why they're learning it, and how they're doing it, it changes everything. The second thing is that we should be giving young people more opportunities to do work that has real impact and consequences. That changes the way you work. If you know that this building has to stand up and not fall down, and it has to accommodate farmers from all over your county, you're going to think about it differently, and you're going to make choices based on the understanding that every decision you make matters. And then lastly, this project also would not have happened if we didn't have partnerships with the mayor, with farmers, with some funders, with other teachers, with small business owners. We needed all of that collaboration. We couldn't have done this just ourselves. So that's another really important thing for students to be able to connect with individuals outside of school to make these things happen, that they should have to negotiate. How do you do something in real life through multiple partners? And not just any partners, but radical partners that you may not even like or agree with, but that you know you need to work with in order to make this work possible. So this is the first project I ever did with high school students. And to me, it also proved to me that this type of learning was powerful and necessary, and that it doesn't happen enough. So the second question I'm always asking myself, which is sort of the follow-up to the first one, is that once we're doing meaningful work, how do we do that in such a way that honors and hears the stories and voices of our students? I think that a lot of students feel very disconnected from the things that they're being taught. And so if we can make that learning feel personal to them, then everyone thrives. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I was working with another group of high school students, this time back in California. And many of my students are recent immigrants. Many are living in a part of the Bay Area in California that has a huge housing crisis. There's not enough housing, there's not enough affordable housing. It's very bad. And there are also a lot of civic leaders that are writing policy that makes it very difficult for the socioeconomically disenfranchised to own and establish home ownership. So many of my students were feeling this very personally. Some of them had been homeless. Many of them lived in a very small apartment with like 4 generations crammed into one room. And this was something that they brought to school with them. They would come to school having not slept well, or perhaps not sleeping at all, or not having a place to sleep. And so I was interested in this not as an experiment in sympathy, but as a way to channel something that they were feeling very personally into work that mattered. So this is an image from a homeless shelter where there are individuals living here on a temporary basis, and they live in these very small structures. This is tiny. This is like about, I have to convert to meters. It's very small. It's like about this big, okay? And so this homeless shelter, this organization contacted us and said, we need one more house. We have room for 25 houses, but we only have 24. Would you be able to build us the 25th? And I said, absolutely. In fact, I have high school students who are already thinking about what it means to have housing, to feel like you have a home, and to feel safe in that home. So even though not all of my students were homeless, in fact, only a handful were, they all felt this feeling of what does it mean to be insecure in your own home, in your own housing situation. That was a personal thing to them. And so when we embarked on this project, designing and building this home for a homeless individual, those were the questions that they were reflecting in their own lives, reflecting that back within their work. So we designed this house. We built hundreds and hundreds of models, tore them apart, put them back together. We had to design this house so that it could be constructed by 80 teenagers who I only had for 1 hour each. I had 20 of them for an hour, and then another 20 for an hour, etc. which is like the worst possible way to run a construction site, but that's what I had to deal with. So what we did is we came up with these framing plans where each group could pick up exactly where the last group left off. This was inspired by a student who's really into comic books and graphic novels, and he said, why don't we design the plans like a comic book, so I can say I'm on frame number 36, and then the next group can pick up right there. So this was really cool too, because building a house is, I mean, it's hard, but it's not that hard. It is hard as a workflow to try to do that with 80 teenagers who you only have for an hour. So this was an interesting design solution to that. And then we started building. We had color-coded hard hats. Each color was a different team. So we started raising the walls on the home. We put up all of this siding. This wood is from shipping pallets. And we had a donation of 200 shipping pallets, and my students painstakingly took them apart, which is horrible. I don't know if any of you have tried to take apart a pallet. It is not fun. They took apart 200 of them, planed them down into the right sizes, stained them, and then we actually built two. We built two identical houses that were mirror images of each other. So these are the final houses and some of the students that worked on it. And this is the person that's living in it, who now has a home. What I love so much about this project is that all of the design decisions that they made, instead of thinking about this as charity, like we're building a house for someone else, they took it very personally. They were thinking, would I want to live in this home? So their standard was very high. Instead of thinking, well, I'm just building this for a homeless person, so it doesn't matter. That is a horrible way to think, and that doesn't make for good learning or good design. So I was so proud of my students that they were able to take the things they were feeling themselves and channel that into creative decisions that are now benefiting someone else's life. So I learned a couple things from this process as well. One is that I think that we as educators are our most natural state of being is to stand up and profess, like, these are the things I know. And yet that doesn't really work in creative learning environments. And so I saw my job, especially in a project where there was so much personal investment, that I had to be more of a mediator and less of this kind of teacher. Also, when you're doing work that feels very personal and often emotional, I found that with my students, it was less important for them to do perfect work and more important for them to feel like they could be brave and to try to solve problems in new ways, to make it safe for them to fail and not to punish them when the thing that they tried didn't work perfectly. And then lastly, when we do work like this that is emotional and that is personal, we have to respect each other as colleagues and classmates. So I tried really hard to cultivate this environment of critique, but constructive critique, and collaboration. So if I'm over here working on something and I show it to you, I need for you to give me useful feedback, and then maybe you take that and turn it into something else. That none of this could happen alone. And it also had to happen through a culture of support and mutual respect. Also in the course of this project, this leads me to my final story, this is when I started to notice something that was happening with my female students, which was that they were all very smart, all incredibly talented, and yet there were moments where on the construction site, they were stepping back from taking the initiative to do things that I knew they knew how to do and allowing the boys to do it. And this made me very, very angry because I have been that girl. I've been the girl on the construction site who is actually in charge, who is kind of like, well, whatever, I don't want to make anyone mad. So I've been there. But it's 2018 and we're past that. So I wanted to create an environment where the girls not only felt safe to be leaders, but where they also felt like I am the leader and I am in charge and this is my space. So this is an ongoing question that I continue to ask myself, and I think we should all be considering as we're making these different models of education, that how do we make those spaces, whether they're maker spaces or classrooms or whatever, how do we make them the most inviting and equitable so we're not leaving people out? How do we make sure that all of these new models of learning and technology are not alienating specific parts of our talented population? So my response to this has been, I opened a new program. This is a physical space. It's called Girls Garage. And this is a space that's only for girls, ages 9 to 17. And we come together and we build amazing things. That's it. This is a space where we practice. We have a lot of fun. We build wooden robots because we want to, but we also practice bravery. And what that means is that as a 10-year-old girl, this is Alma, she's 10 years old, she's using a chop saw, the blade is like bigger than her head, and the first time she used it, she was terrified. And the 10th time she used it, she was less terrified. And the 100th time she used it, she was teaching someone else how to use it. So instead of saying, I'm not sure if you saw, this is our motto, fear less, build more. Instead of saying, don't be afraid, we actually say, you know what, it's okay that you're afraid, and we're gonna do it anyway. And I think exercising that muscle in a learning environment is incredibly powerful for students to acknowledge that they might have barriers, but the point is to learn how to overcome those barriers. We also do welding. Welding is my favorite thing to teach. I love welding. I'm very good at it. I love teaching young girls how to weld. There's something about welding that feels like you're a superhero, like you just fused metal and you get to wear all this gear. It's amazing. So that's something that also, the physical experience of doing something scary and outside of your comfort zone changes the way you think about what's possible. The culmination of all of this at Girls Garage is that we want to make sure that the skills we're developing are being put towards things in our community, just like the other work that I showed. That I can teach you how to weld all day long, but if we're not making something that has a real impact in the world, then what is it for? So these are 2 shelves that we built for the women's shelter, which is very close to Girls Garage, or a planter boxes. This is at the women's shelter that we partner with, or a greenhouse for a local community garden. So working with these groups of girls has taught me a lot about what it means to be truly inclusive. So I think some of the ways that we can think about doing this is, first of all, just to be aware, like to look around and ask yourself, who is not in this room? And why are they not in this room? Are they not in this room because they're not interested, as people would have you believe that girls are just not interested in STEM? That is categorically untrue. Why are they not in this room? And then to create spaces for that segment of the population that feel safe and also specific. What I mean by specific is that it should be very clear what the purpose of that space is and how that speaks to a young girl. So when girls come into Girls Garage, they know that they're there to learn how to build stuff. They know that there are teachers there who will make them feel safe doing that. And they know that if they're 9 years old, they can stay here until they're 28. And then lastly, I think acknowledging that having educators or mentors who have shared lived experience with their students makes mentorship and support much, much easier. That is not to say that if you have a very different identity and lived experience from your student, that that's not possible. But I think in terms of, especially with young girls or students of color, I think it does help to have a person who you can see yourself in, where you can say, I could grow up and be like that. So that's something to consider too, that who we are is also connected to how we teach and who we teach. So I'll just close by saying, I love building. Building is who I am. It's how I came to love learning. You may not be a builder, but I am certain that there is something that you love to do, and there's a moment that you can probably identify as the moment where you fell in love with learning. And I'm just going to take a wild guess that moment for you probably was not in a classroom. It may have been in the garage with your father, or cooking with your mother, or at the library. So I find that very interesting, and I'm particularly interested in how we can help expand what we think of as learning, and to make learning far more creative and far more daring and more transformative for young people. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you.